Celeste is a critically acclaimed action platformer developed by Extremely OK Games. They recently released Celeste 64, which is an open-source project to commemorate the 6th anniversary of the original Celeste, and development of their next major game, Earthblade, is underway. Noel Berry is a programmer at Extremely OK Games, and he joins the show to talk about developing Celeste and Earthblade, gameplay engineering, the state of C# versus C++ for game development, and more. Joe Nash is a developer, educator, and award-winning community builder who has worked at companies including GitHub, Twilio, Unity, and PayPal. Joe got his start in software development by creating mods and running servers for Gary's Mod, and game development remains his favorite way to experience and explore new technologies and concepts.
Welcome, Noel. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing good. How are you?
Yeah, it's been a good week. It's been fun to see everything that's come out of GDC, which I know you have also, you're hot on the tails of it. So it's always an exciting week for game news, I think. So
yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, so to kick that off, you've been working with Extremely OK Games for a while, and I named a few titles there, Towerfall and Celeste, which obviously go back now, surprisingly, 10 years. How did you get your start with game development? Where did your game dev journey start?
Yeah, I started making games as a kid. So like when I was 11 and 12, I downloaded a program called GameMaker, and I didn't know how to program at all at that point. So I was just kind of fumbling around, messing with stuff because I was excited about games. I like playing games a lot, and I wanted to find, I don't know, it just seems exciting to kind of mess with them. So yeah, I downloaded GameMaker, and it took quite a few years of just like experimenting and messing around with it. And eventually I started making games that actually made sense. And GameMaker had this thing like a drag and drop thing. So you could just drag and drop these blocks in.
Yeah.
And that kind of like describe how game objects should do stuff. And so I didn't code at all. And then eventually you could like drag in code blocks and code a little bit. So I started by just copying and pasting people's code from the internet into mine to like make it do special things that the coding blocks or the drag and drop blocks couldn't do. And then over time I just kind of, tweaked those and started editing them myself to learn how to code. So
that's awesome. Yeah, those kind of tools, like the ones where you've got a visual editor, but then it allows you to like have essentially like a non-visual part inside of it, have always been like provide a really nice staircase. That's really cool to hear. What version was that? Would have been GameMaker 1 or 2 at that point?
No, that would be GameMaker like 6.1.
Okay.
So they went through different versions. Like eventually, like in I think 2015 or 14, somewhere around there, they like rebooted the whole thing.
Right.
And that was like GameMaker Studio 1, and then they had GameMaker Studio 2. But before that, like in 2000 or like 1999, somewhere around there, they had GameMaker 1, and then they went through to like 6.1 was around, I think 2005, I want to say. And then they went to 8, and then eventually they reset it to 1 again.
Okay, that makes sense. I was like, I think of Construct or something. Where did I get 1 or 2 from? But that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think what most people will know you for is Celeste, which is, I guess the more recent of the 2 release games. And one of the things that I really want to dig into, because I'm a huge Pico 8 fan, is the game's origins and how you got started with Pico 8 and that whole journey. So, you made the original Celeste in Pico 8, and even since the release, you've revisited Pico 8 for Celeste a couple of times with Celeste 2. Like, making the sequel in Pico 8 was I was like, okay, that's awesome. Like, what keeps bringing you back to Pico 8, even after, using a full game engine to develop Celeste?
I think I like limitations a lot, just creatively, when you have kind of a limited, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be like Pico 8's like technically limited, but just kind of limitations in general. So I like game jams for the same reason, that are kind of like, well, you only have 48 hours. So what you're able to do is like quite scoped down. So you have to kind of think creatively in that space. And I like that for Pico 8 too, where you're kind of thinking of stuff like, well, I can't do, a lot of stuff in this. So what can I do, and what's kind of fun to explore in that space, both technically and like game design and art and everything. So I think that's how I am constantly kind of coming back to Pico 8 and tools like that, just because they're fun to kind of experiment in and play around in, mostly due to the limitations. I think if Pico 8 was the same but had no limitations, then it would kind of be like, well, I'll just code in my own engine or code in bigger stuff, because what's the point?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess like in Celeste's case, the prototype was Pico 8, and then you moved to building it into a full game. To what extent, obviously I imagine that a lot of the gameplay mechanics and how Celeste evolved in terms of, the basis for the gameplay and the gameplay loop was informed by the Pico 8 restrictions. How do you navigate that as you're removing those restrictions? Like, do you open up the concept and what you can do, or do you try and stay true to it?
Yeah, I mean, When we started the larger game coming out of Pico 8, we started with basically the same game. I mean, we increased the resolution a bunch. Like main Celeste is at least 6 times bigger. I don't know. It's like Pico 8 is 128 by 128, so we expanded that a lot. But initially, it kind of started off quite similar. And then we added, like the original Pico 8 doesn't have climbing, so we added climbing quite early on because it kind of played well with the idea of climbing a mountain and the dash mechanics. But yeah, I think to start, it was quite similar, just kind of like bigger play space and like scrolling camera, things that are just kind of initially like way easier to do, not in Pico 8, because you just like, well, there's more space, we have a scrolling camera, and then the stuff that kind of comes out of that, the level design and the things that come out of that. You know, that we added multiple levels instead of just one kind of long level. But even the first like chapter in Celeste is kind of similar to the Pico 8 first chapter in a lot of senses. Just it's like it doesn't have a lot of narrative. It's kind of this one level you're going up, and that was kind of the start of bigger Celeste. So it, in a lot of ways, it started kind of the same,
right?
And then
almost as a direct port.
Yeah, almost as a port. And then once you have that kind of established and working, then you just kind of iterate on it, and it keeps going.
Awesome. So yeah, I guess speaking about moving from Pico 8 to the full game, I know the full game is built in XNA, but can you tell us a little bit about, the technology behind the game?
Yeah, so XNA is a deprecated Microsoft game framework. I think it was deprecated in 2013, which is like over 10 years now, which is kind of wild. But yeah, at the time, both Maddie and I were making games in XNA, even though it was already deprecated when we started Celeste by like 4 years or something. Yeah, but I was making a game called Skytorn, and Maddie had obviously made Towerfall in XNA. And we both just liked using C# a lot for like the game programming, at least. It was just very easy to kind of make game objects and design stuff in a language like that. And at that point, there was like open source ports of XNA. There's one called Monogame and one called FNA. And those kind of brought XNA to other platforms like, Mac and Linux, and then also consoles. So it felt safe in regard, even though it was a deprecated, dead framework. It felt like, one, we were very comfortable in it and liked working in it. And then two, it was also just like, despite being deprecated, was quite stable. It had a good community around it and a good support of like open source alternatives. And like, and I mean, the XNA version itself still runs on Windows, 11 years later, because Windows is fairly good at keeping old stuff running. So yeah.
Just not new stuff.
No.
So I feel like I missed the XNA wave. I've been aware of it in the background as being a very popular framework, but not being a C# person, I feel like it's never something I've explored. But like the open source projects are like still maintained and going, right? Like FNA I saw was getting a bunch of funding off the back of the Unity debacle and stuff. They are still like active in a way.
Yeah, both FNA and Monogame both got a bunch of funding. I think, Relogic, I think the Terraria people.
Cool.
Which is really, really great to see. And both of them are like moving forward, which is, really awesome. And they're both like, they contribute a lot. Like the FNA maintainers contribute a lot to the development of SDL2, which is sort of like everything in games uses SDL2. Yeah, everything is like built on top of it. So that I think it is cool to see those projects like moving forward, because they just in turn, a lot of development time in them is actually spent in SDL2, which is really cool.
That's awesome. So one particular part of that build out of the full game that I wanted to ask about. So there is a relatively well-known, I don't think this is a spoiler, hopefully it's not after all this time, there's a relatively well-known Easter egg that the original Pico 8 version of Celeste is embedded within the full Celeste. And I think, like, I had this moment when I realized that Celeste was on Switch where I was like, that can't be the original Pico 8 car, right? Like, did you write a Pico 8 emulator for that? Like, how is that working?
I thought about writing an emulator for it. I was very close to doing it because it seemed like a fun project. But I think at the time we were kind of rushing through a lot of stuff. And I was like, I don't have time to make like a proper emulator.
It's like on this huge side quest,
Yeah, no. So I just went kind of line by line I wrote like an API. Like I made all the Lua, like all the Pico 8 Lua calls. I kind of made like a light C# API that like remapped to our game engine stuff.
Right.
And then I just went line by line in the Lua version and translated it to C#, which wasn't as bad as it sounds because Pico 8 is obviously quite simple. And so the amount of calls and stuff I had to do were not too bad. I had to write like certain custom math functions. Like I couldn't use the built-in C# math, like I think sine functions and stuff like that. I had to like remap them to kind of slightly different versions and stuff like that.
Why is that?
I think it was just simple stuff like I can't quite remember anymore,
Didn't
but just
quite
simple stuff.
The same as the Lua version? Or?
Yeah, the numbers you get out aren't quite rounding the same way and stuff like that.
Fascinating.
And there were actually some mistakes. Like, they wasn't exactly one-to-one for a while, but at some point, people in the community kind of listed everything that was wrong with it with detailed explanations, and I fixed all of them eventually. But yeah.
Yeah. So that's brings me to actually something that I thought was something quite interesting about what you did. And I guess it was on your personal GitHub, so I assume it was you personally, where you ran a public bug tracker for Celeste, which is unusual, I think, for games full stop, but even for indie games, alongside, the Pico 8 code and even some bits from the actual code. Like, what led to you doing that? Because, like I said, it feels unusual to me that game devs do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really into just open source stuff in general.
Yeah.
And I'd say I mostly got more into open source stuff, I'd say, after Celeste. I was kind of just making stuff and working away. And then afterwards, I was kind of, looking into stuff more and thinking about things more. And so I guess we just wanted to kind of share some of the process for how we made the game and kind of what it looked like, even though we haven't released the full source code. But yeah, I was kind of just like seeing if it would be useful to people and sharing at least some of what went into making the game. And yeah, honestly, the bug tracker for like the GitHub version, we used it a little bit. It was good to kind of see what was happening, but still most of our bug reports come through email and we fixed them through that. But the GitHub was kind of just a cool exploration of that. Yeah. And I'd say like since Celeste, I've used it a lot more. Like for Celeste 64, we just posted the whole thing on GitHub. And I'm still to this day, like, going through the issues and fixing stuff where like people are submitting bug reports. And that's a lot more of a, I'd say, true open source and, community driven thing that's been really fun. Celeste it's something that I would like to explore opening more of in the future. It's just this kind of weird ground that I haven't totally figured out yet. And because it's in C#, it lives in this kind of interesting middle ground where like we haven't technically released the source code, but it's in C#, so you can decompile it to almost exactly what we had, minus comments. So it's people who like mod it and want to mess with the actual code can do so fairly easily, but we haven't officially like released it all.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, I know at one point the framework you used for it was, parts of the framework, a version of the framework is open source. You've released, there's whole blog posts about the lighting system and the physics system. Like, I guess even without the comments, people can put together a lot of your intent by this point.
Yeah, yes, they can get quite a bit. And obviously the modding scene, like not because of us, but because of just C# and people who are excited about Celeste, they've made really amazing stuff by pulling apart the source code because C# just happens to be so decompilable. And we didn't go through any effort to like hide the source code. Right. So it's just kind of like, yeah, the amount of stuff out there that now that people have been like doing with it is really, really cool and something I kind of want to push forward in future games, but not something I was expecting at all. So I wasn't prepared for it.
Right. So you mentioned this 64, and it's really funny to hear that you're still patching bugs on it, because I think you posted a Mastodon a while ago that like it was a meme that got out of hand. So it's really funny to hear that you're not only have released and shipped that meme, but you are continuing to maintain that meme. Tell us a little bit about Celeste 64.
Yeah, it was basically a meme, I guess. Yeah. We weren't planning to. Well, we kind of threw around the idea of like, oh, it would be fun to do something for the anniversary because it's been 6 years since Celeste came out. And like, 3 years ago, we did like the Celeste Classic 2, which was like a Pico 8 game kind of in the style of Celeste. And we just wanted to do something like that. And we threw around a bunch of ideas. And Celeste 64 was just the one that seemed funniest and like kind of most exciting to work on. But we also didn't want to spend a ton of time. Like we're still like in the midst of making Earthblade and trying to get it done in a reasonable time. So we didn't want to take too much time off. So it's kind of like, well, this sounds like a really fun idea and we really want to do it. So maybe we should try and just allocate like a week. And then it took more than a week, but it was, a lot of fun.
It doesn't sound like it took much more than a week, right? It was like a week and a bit, I think.
I think it was like 10 days, but I definitely burnt out a little bit because I did not sleep a lot. It was really, really fun. It felt like an extended game jam, but I don't know if it was the best idea, but it was a lot of fun.
I do like this tradition y'all have of like doing your own anniversary game jams for the game. I do think that is very cool, especially while you're working on other larger projects. I imagine that must be a nice break of cadence at the very least.
Yeah, it's kind of a good, like, I know other companies do, like, they'll do game, like, around the holidays and stuff. They'll sometimes do, like, oh, we're taking a week off to make something else for fun. And so that it kind of felt like that. We're just like, yeah, okay, we're just taking a small break and doing this and it was, really fun. And then you kind of come back to the main project with, like, a bit more, like, fresh eyes and just ready to kind of dive in again.
Yes, I mean, I had a little go at Celeste. Celeste 64 kicked my butt in a even more severe degree than like Celeste and Celeste Classic 2 did. And I don't know whether it was just the 3D-ness of it that first jump onto the wall, I just could not do it for the longest time.
Yeah, it's not the easiest. Like, it's a bit janky because we made it very fast.
It's great though when you do get it. So I guess for listeners, it's like, I mean, it's kind of inspiration is kind of in the name, right? It's like it's 3D, but it's like low poly polygonal Nintendo 64 graphic kind of style.
Yeah.
How did that style come about? Was that just because what was achievable in 3D at the time, or did you explicitly set out to do that?
We intentionally set out to do that. I mean, there's a few aspects of it. Like, one thing is that we wrote the game entirely in my own little weird C# framework, which has not been used for 3D. It was only a 2D thing. Mm-hmm. So part of it was like, we're not going to do, really intense lighting or, modern graphical effects because this engine does not have any of that in it. So it was mostly just the limitation thing, I guess, that I was talking about earlier with the Pico 8, which is like, we want to actually finish this thing. And we also just want it to be like, use limitations to kind of our advantage of like, if we, scope this down and limit ourselves in terms of how it looks and how it feels and the size and scope and everything, then maybe we can make something kind of cool in that space. So that's the main reasons. And also we kind of wanted to make sure that it was a meme in a certain sense as well, because we didn't want it to, like when we're releasing it, we want to make sure that it has this appearance of, kind of not a serious project. We don't want people coming in expecting like, oh, this is the next Celeste thing, because there's a lot of people out there who want that. And we don't want to like, mislead or like confusion around why is this weird free itch.io game, the next Celeste thing. And so it kind of had all that balance of just limitations and scope and expectations and stuff like that.
That makes sense. I think that's a really cool approach. In the move to 3D, obviously, you were still trying. It's still a Celeste game mechanically. Was there like any mechanics that you found that you had to like that were difficult to get into that new environment, or they had to change around a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it all happened pretty fast because we didn't have a lot of time. But yeah, even just simply thinking about how the dash would work, and we decided to make it. You don't dash literally 360 or like 3D 360. It's not a full sphere of dash direction. It's like a plane of dash direction. And just getting stuff like that, like, thinking how do we actually want to implement that, and other stuff that I think we would have spent a lot more time on if we had time. Like the camera is quite bad, frankly, but I think that's partially because we didn't expect, like we haven't made many 3D games, so we weren't really expecting, what would happen there. So I think we're pretty happy with how the player feels and everything, but the camera could have used a lot more iteration. And that's because I think we just didn't allocate kind of time towards the camera because we weren't thinking about it because we're not used to thinking about it. And then all of a sudden I was like, wow, actually this matters a lot. But that would have turned into a months long thing.
I know. I think the camera control, if you're going for like invoking N64 nostalgia, it definitely does that. It was a very N64 camera for sure.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
So I guess going back to main Celeste, there's a no-clip documentary on Celeste, which is wonderful. And in that documentary, you're talking about, the testing process and the iteration process, because as a platformer as tightly tuned as Celeste feels, I imagine there's a lot of that goes on. But you said this really interesting thing, which is during testing and whilst you're like responding to feedback, that you don't want to polish all the edges off, which was like a really interesting comment I felt. Can you talk a little bit about, if you can recall this interview, hopefully you can. If you could talk a little bit about that like methodology.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically what I was talking about there necessarily, but yeah, I think, when we're like, this is also more in Maddie's realm for sure, but like when we're playtesting stuff, you're trying to strike this balance of like, what is, especially in a platformer like this, like what is actually fun for the player and like what's a fun challenge and what is not working as intended. So a lot of the time, like levels kind of have these stories in them, and you're kind of trying to get the player to do a specific thing, which is, jump over here and then climb this thing and jump over that and then fall down this thing. And you're kind of trying to guide the play into that kind of story you're trying to make. I mean, sometimes the story could change as you play test and watch and like, oh, that wasn't working at all. So they're doing something else that's way cooler. And I think just in that area, you don't want to like, if the game is about platforming, you don't want to make it so that there's never any kind of conflict in the level, I guess. But you also don't want it to have unintended things that don't really match what you're trying to do with it. So I think when we were playtesting, we just eliminate a lot of like, basically almost like bugs, I call them, like things that we were not expecting or things that just weren't feeling right for the player. But keep things that are kind of like, actual challenges and fun, edges in terms of like in the space.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess to go back from there back to the GitHub. So one of the things that the GitHub does contain, which actually was one of the things I think I knew about this file before I played Celeste because I had heard about it, is the player class for the game, which is, I believe, 5,000 lines long. And I was familiar with this file as like, I had heard the lore of like, hey, you know, this is a great example of like what it takes to make a really great fitting platform. Like, look at all the constants and the conditions, checking every permutation of ways this player could exist and then modifying how it moves a little bit. So I guess one question I had about that is when you have that file and you're tracking all these and you're trying to iterate on this game and you've got all these constants that like change or like affect the movement in different circumstances and all these conditionals that affect the movement in different circumstances, how do you watch a test of the game or play a moment of the game and go, I need to tweak this constant here? Like, how are you tracking all those things as you're developing and iterating?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the player class, it is huge. That's kind of a monolithic like class. And it can be, I think making it that big can definitely make it sometimes hard to figure out where you need to be. But in general, you kind of get, like, we're quite a small team. So it's me and Maddie doing most of the programming. So you kind of get an intuitive sense of like where things are. And, you know, we have these kind of like regions that we block stuff into as well in terms of Celeste. So you kind of just learn over time, like, oh, if I want to change, you know, how this part of the player works, you can just edit these constants. I definitely don't think it's the most like, you know, for someone new coming into it, it's like, wow, feels like spaghetti, and it kind of is. And I don't deny that it's a bit of a mess, but it works in terms of just like all the moveset of the player is quite tightly coupled together. There's no like real solid, like there are states, but they're quite intermingled and react with each other quite a lot. And in that kind of environment, it feels kind of good to just have it all there and have the constants easy to like modify and tweak and just have everything in kind of one place. I don't think like Earthblade, it's more broken up. Like all the states are in their own classes and stuff like that. But that game is also the states are more defined. They're kind of more like when you're in this state, you're doing this thing. Right. Whereas Celeste is a bit more squishy and like flowy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this kind of touches on a theme that we keep coming back to, I guess, when we talk to game devs, which is like this idea that, I don't know, because it only has to run once, it has to work. Like, there's a lot of things you can do in game dev code that people would scream at you for in other forms of code that are just like, you can just make the game and like, you know, magic constants are fine. They work. They're a good way of dealing with it. And like, it just lets you crack on, right? And I definitely feel that looking at that code. And if you mentioned Earthblade there. So in that README for that file, you have kind of like, I guess, a little bit of a retrospective, which I'd highly recommend listeners read. And I think at the time that was written, that was still written quite a few years ago. Now that you've been working, you know, going from Celeste into Earthblade, was there anything that you were looking forward to doing differently in particular?
Yes, definitely. I think now I'd have to go look at the README because I don't remember what it says, but or what I was thinking, you know, 7 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, no, definitely there's a lot of code changes that I have been doing in Earthblade and want to continue to do. I think like Celeste was definitely kind of a product of, it was a fairly fast game to come together. And I think the way I've coded has changed a lot in the last 6 years, and parts of it haven't too. But yeah, I think things are a lot more broken up in Earthblade. Earthblade's a bit more of a systems-y game. It's still a platformer, but it has a lot more kind of systems and stuff. And that has just like meant there's a lot more kind of architecture around how stuff is structured and systems and states and things like that. Whereas Celeste was kind of like, oh, there's game objects and they exist and that's it. Game objects exist in the scene and they just do their thing. Whereas Earthblade's a bit more like there's proper systems and things that are like kind of running and things are sending messages and checking with each other. And it's a bit more maybe proper right. in terms of a lot of people's idea. But yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of Earthblade, I'd love to chat a little bit about that. So I guess since it's not out yet, it might be useful to give listeners a bit of an intro. Can you tell us a little bit about what Earthblade is, well, what it is currently at least?
Yeah, that's going to change too probably. Yeah, Earthblade is a game that the Celeste team is working on. And we started it like a few years after Celeste. So it's been working on it for maybe 2.5 years, something around that. And it's also a platformer, but it's thinking a different space than Celeste. So Celeste was about movement and levels, and Earthblade's it's a bit more combat focused and more exploration focused, I think. So the space is kind of larger and the levels are more like, well, I can't talk too much about the levels, but like it's a space that you're just kind of more free form exploring.
Yeah, I guess, well, you can't speak about levels. The trailer you released at the Game Awards very much does do like a camera pan across like the whole world kind of idea, right? Like it seems so far, at least from that footage, quite open.
Yeah.
So obviously, you know, we spoke about Celeste being built on and already at the time deprecated framework. Is Earthblade also XNA? Have you moved on from XNA now?
So actually, we did at first move on. So for the first part of development of Earthblade, it was written in C++ because at the time, like I loved C# and working in games in it. It was a lot harder to port than other stuff. And this is kind of getting into the technical parts of C#, but like at the time, to get our game running on consoles, we used a transpiler that would take the C#. So C# gets compiled into IL code, and then that gets run on your computer and turned into actual bytecode at runtime with the just-in-time compiler. So at the time, it would take the C# IL code and then translate that into C++ and then recompile that for the target console. So the version of Celeste right now that's on like, all the consoles is C++, but it's like translated with the machine or the program from the C# IL code.
And then original XNA, then FNA and one again, depending on the platform, and then transpiled the C++ from there still. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So it was kind of this like big rigmarole. It's really cool. And the technology there is really great. And the person who did all that work is amazing. And they did the ports of Celeste for that. It was kind of like I wanted to be in a situation where it was easier for us to just kind of like, whenever we wanted, just compile our game with the existing code to whatever platform we want. And so that meant C++. That said, though, as we worked on the game, there's been a bunch of changes to C#, and one of them is called native AOT, which just means like ahead of time compile, which is like what every other word,
just normal compilation, right? It's what people think of by compilation. Yeah,
that's what people think of compilation. So like C and C++ and Rust and all those things, that's their default, is they ahead of time compile. Whereas C# the default is compiling to an intermediate language and then compiling at runtime. Anyways, to say, in the last few years, C# has gotten a lot of progress in terms of like ahead of time compilation, which means that it's a lot more accessible to have C# itself just running on consoles like natively, which is really great. So about a year ago, we actually ported Earthblade to FNA, which is the open source port of XNA. So that's what it's in right now, which is and that was mostly just because we like working in C# a lot more. In C++, there's no compile times anymore. It just runs really fast. C# compile times are like 1 second. So things like that were really nice for our iteration. And then also because of the changes to C# in the last few years, it's just a lot more straightforward for us to actually, we can just compile our code directly to the platform we want.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. So I mean, aside from that language switch, you mentioned the way you program a lot the way you program has changed a lot in the last 6 years. Like, are there any like other notable technology changes that you're going with this time that weren't, you either weren't available or you weren't using for Celeste?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we're doing differently now. We have a lot more tools in terms of like Celeste is there's a lot of weird janky stuff in Celeste. Like I think the player class even has a big start of it where it just like defines when to play sounds on certain frames and stuff, which is like a very weird thing to have in your player code. So things like that we have tools now that take our like ASprite files, and ASprite's like a pixel art program, but it has built-in animation. So to like import our ASprite files, and then we can like, place where we want sound, like the sound designers can go in and actually place sounds where they need sounds to be. And then, proper things like that, so that we don't have sound timing inside of our player code randomly for animations, or an enemy doesn't have to like say like, oh, on frame 7, play this sound. Our audio designers can actually just like go into the editor and place the sound where they want it to be. Stuff like that. And then, there's been a lot of changes to C# as well. It has a lot more, they've been doing a lot of performance stuff around like stack allocation stuff and, avoiding garbage collection calls a lot more. So I think my time in C++ too, I spent a few years making stuff in C++, has kind of like changed my thinking around, how allocation stuff works. I learned a lot about how, computers actually work and stuff. And so I think I brought a lot of that kind of mindset into C#, which I didn't really previously have, just in terms of how to like manage stuff to make things go fast.
Right. That's cool. Was that, exploring C++ and learning that, was that why you built Blah? Was Blah your C++ game framework?
Yeah. Blah's my weird C++ game framework. Yeah, that's why I built that. I was making both Earthblade was built on top of that for a while, and I had a side project that I was making in that. And that was kind of my attempt at just like porting the parts I liked about XNA into just C++, and just thought, I'm just going to use C++. I'll just make my own little like framework. It has a little sprite batcher and can draw stuff with like OpenGL or DirectX.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my experiment into that, which was pretty fun. I had a good time with it. But yeah, C++, I never 100% got comfortable with C++. I'd say I was fine with it, and I had a good time, but actually working on stuff on a day-to-day basis never felt quite as nice as just like coding in C# to me.
Right. But is that for reasons other than like, the compilation times and the iteration cycle? But are you caught up by foot guns a lot? I feel like that's like a lot of the FUD around using C++, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues around C++. Like, yeah, C++ has a lot of like design problems, and even stuff in their newer code, like they'll have like they introduce like coroutines, but there's all sorts of weird memory issues with that, and it's really easy to accidentally like I can't even remember all the problems I ran into with new features that like if you didn't use them in a very particular way, it was really easy to leak memory or have things explode in ways that were not very intuitive. And I mean, I like managing memory, but in C# I like the ability to be like, when I need to, I can really care about how things are allocated and where things are going. And if I need something to happen fast, I can, do that. And then when I don't care because it's like a main menu or something, I just allocate stuff and throw it away, and who cares? Because it doesn't actually matter for, especially our kind of game. If you're making, a really high performance first person shooter or something that needs to be like every like CPU cycle basically matters for them, then that's a different conversation. But for us, when we're a small team making a platformer, I want to be performant where it matters and be able to kind of have the ability to just like make stuff fast and iterate on things fast without worrying about like how specifically is this being allocated.
Right.
Yeah,
makes sense. So I guess while I'm talking about making your own tools and what tooling's been used in Earthblade. So for Celeste, I believe you made a map editor, level designer. The distinction between the two is blurry to me. But you made a map editor called Ogmo, which later was rebuilt in hacks and open sourced, which is super cool. Is Ogmo returning for Earthblade, or are you making new tooling again, or using something else off the shelf?
Yeah, so for Earthblade, no, we're using our own tooling or a new tooling thing. For Earthblade, we just have a level editor. We have like an entire editor that, like I said, was editing kind of animation and sound stuff. So we have like we call it like a sequence editor, which is basically like actions. So you can put in like sprites or animations and then add sounds, or we also do like hitbox frame data and stuff like that in it. And then we also have other tools like a map. We have a map editor, and that's really nice for C# because C# has reflection, which is really cool. So we can just like, dynamically load, like, we can add a new game object to Earthblade, and then it just immediately shows up in our map editor. We don't have to do anything.
Really
it's
cool.
Just now it's in our map editor, and we can like place it there and do stuff with it. So having the editor built around the game itself, like in the actual same, it's not the same code. It's different. There are different exes and different libraries and stuff. But having it be able to just kind of like import the game and then edit stuff is really nice. So I like, as much as I like external level editors, and we did an external level editor for all of Celeste, having it kind of integrated into the actual project is really nice for Earthblade.
Perfect. Then moving on to, I guess, the gameplay itself and what the game is. So I noticed this when I first went on the webpage, and then the team dug into it a bit in, I think, a Q&A you did on YouTube in 2023. So it's described as an explore action platformer, which when I first read that, I was like, that sounds kind of like a Metroidvania. But then you actually, in the Q&A, you explicitly said, like, we're not using the word Metroidvania because we don't want to constrain ourselves, which I think is, in this time where everything is either a Souls-like or Metroidvania or whatever, was a really interesting comment. Can you talk a little bit about, like, the constraints of the Metroidvania label that you're trying to avoid without giving too much away about what you're trying to build, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think ultimately people will call it Metroidvania, and more casually we do too. But I think like words like that are definitely useful. We're just trying to, I think, manage expectations a little bit about what kind of game it is. And I'd say it's a bit more, the game itself is a bit more based on exploration. Metroidvanias are very based on exploration. I want to say that in terms of like, there's not really like rooms so much in the game. Like you're kind of just exploring these spaces, and it's very free form in terms of like how you're doing things and where you're going. And so I don't want to get into too many details, but like it's not as much of a Metroidvania in terms of like, get this power up to open that door.
Right.
It's more just like there's a big space and you're kind of going through it. And so that's why we're kind of using more like, it's more of like an exploration and action game, but it's going to be called a Metroidvania for sure. And that's fine too.
Yeah. Awesome. And then one of the other, while I'm talking about things you've done on social media for the game, one of the posts, I think it was Christmas, you've already teased a sequence break for Earthblade on the XOK social media, which, given how successful and popular Celeste is with the speedrunning community, made me wonder, like, are you already thinking about speedrunning as you're developing the game? I know you've mentioned in the past that, like, you hadn't really, I think Maddie said this on the Reddit maybe, that like you hadn't really thought about modding before you built Celeste, and now you're much more aware of it. Is that a similar case of speedrunning?
Yes, we're definitely thinking about it as we make the game. Like, it's definitely really important to us in general. Speedrunning was really important to Celeste and its longevity. I love watching speedruns in that entire scene. So it is really, we want to make the game with that in mind for sure. I think it's a different kind of speedrun game. Like, it won't be run the same way that Celeste is because it's a different kind of game. Like, Celeste is about the movement tech and how you can like push that to the extreme. Whereas Earthblade, I think, will probably have less like obvious movement tech and be more about like it's a bit more in the Metroidvania kind of sense
critical
of like,
paths and working out what you can skip and
yeah, totally. So it's going to be a different kind of speedrun, but it's definitely still in our what we're thinking about.
Awesome. Speaking of the Celeste speedrunning, I mean, I know it's been a long time in a very big community, but was there any like particular what was your like speedrunning, oh my god, they're doing this to my game moment for Celeste? If you can remember that one.
Yeah, I think when it broke like 30 minutes, the speedrun is kind of when I was like, wow, that's like, I never thought that would happen. So, and Celeste is about like, there's not really sequence breaks in Celeste so much as just like really amazing movement tech. And there's short sequence breaks that are like, you can skip this kind of object or get under this thing. The physics itself doesn't really allow for like, clipping through multiple rooms or like skipping entire large segments. So it's mostly just like an accumulation of like thousands and thousands of like really specific little movement techs that get you to where you need to be way faster. So it's just, all that stuff combined is kind of like really impressive to me, and how people managed to, because we knew there was a lot of movement tech, but I don't think we knew that it would go as far as it did.
Yeah. Speaking of the physics, this reminded me of, I think Maddie had written in the past about the physics engine used in both Towerfall and Celeste, and about the fact that you rolled your own physics based on AABB, which is access aligned bounding boxes, I believe. And I guess I wanted to ask, like, I think a lot of people coming into game dev now are very used to like, hey, I need to pick up this game engine that has everything included, and I use the APIs that are given to me. So I wanted to ask a little bit about like what led to the decision to roll your own physics for those games.
Yeah, so I mean, we took the approach a lot. Like, we don't use big game engines. We kind of use open source frameworks, and we use, we kind of roll a lot of our own stuff, which is both good and bad. It can backfire sometimes, but mostly it's just about like control over how we want the stuff to work. I'd say like, we're both fairly competent programmers. We're not definitely the most technical or the most like, doing the most high level stuff or anything, but we're comfortable making, for example, a physics engine that is simple. It's not a true physics engine. It's not doing all the, stuff like Box2D would do or something, but it's mostly about, I think, control and how, like, if we want something to change, we can kind of just do it. We're not fighting with the system that's kind of like a black box of like, oh, it's just doing this thing and we have to work around that. So it's much more about just like, we really care about very specific intricacies and how stuff moves and how stuff collides and how stuff reacts. And to do that, it just felt, it's kind of like why, like in the terms of Celeste, like the actual physics of Celeste is very simple. It's, axis line bounding boxes, they move pixel by pixel and don't overlap with each other. So the code part of that is like fairly simple. So it's kind of like, why not do that? And then we can have full control over what's happening versus, a black box where we're kind of fighting with what it's deciding to do. And I think you can get the same result if you used an actual physics engine, but it would be a lot more like fighting or turning off 90% of the features. Then it's like, why are we going through this instead of just kind of making our own thing? And I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer there at all. It's just kind of what we find comfortable and what's the fastest way for us to kind of get what we want out of the code and out of the systems. And that often means it's actually nicer and easier just to like write our own 500 line thing than use an entire huge library that pulls in megabytes and stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I'm glad to hear that explanation. Because the size of the commercial engines are getting so big, I think there's an instinct that like, I should make the choice that has everything I will ever possibly need ever, even though I'm never going to touch it, instinct, right? Rather than using the tool set that I need to finish the game today. So it's, good to hear.
Often I think that you can even, if you decide like, oh, I really need this thing, there's often really good libraries out there that do provide that. Like if we decided, oh, you know what, we really do need a physics engine, we really need stuff to like bounce off in certain ways and have friction and all this,
Right.
kinematic stuff, then we could use Box2D, and it's an amazing library that is open source and available.
And I imagine has FNA wrappers. So we've mentioned a couple times throughout the interview, the fact that the team quite often builds things in game jams or comes out of game jams. So going back to that 2023 Q&A, one of the things that the team was talking about was the fact that, Earthblade is taking a little bit longer because it's the first game that like you've made from scratch that hasn't like come from a game jam prototype or someone's personal project. And so I was interested in how that is for the team, approaching building a game in a different way from a different foundation, but also I really was interested in what the difference in your process is doing that.
Yeah, it is true that almost all the other games we've worked on have come out of, sort of quick experiments. And then I think that can give a lot of direction to the game because you're kind of like, we're making this game and this is what it is. And then it just goes like, if the game jam version works, then, you're just kind of elaborating on it in a sense. But yeah, with that, I think there's a few things is that doesn't always work. Like you can't make a game jam for certain kinds of games because it's just, you don't have enough time to actually implement the mechanics that are required. So I guess for Earthblade, we had more of a slightly larger scope and larger idea for what we wanted, like mechanically the game to do. So I think it kind of came from there, where just like I don't think we couldn't make a game jam version of Earthblade very fast, or I don't think we'd be able to pull that off because it just mechanically requires more stuff. So I'd say one is like, it lets us kind of make stuff that we're not super used to, which is fun, but also make stuff that we're not super used to. Sorry.
Yeah.
And that's actually quite hard also.
Right.
So we're kind of outside our comfort zone for sure. And that means it's taking longer and a lot more experimentation than like Celeste was extremely smooth because we had this kind of like foundation of like, this is what the game is. And now we're just making that game. And, we make level 1 and then we make level 2 and we make level 3 and then we're done. And Earthblade's been a lot more of kind of like exploring the space and like, so it's taking us longer and will continue to take us a bit longer.
Perfect. Yeah, and I guess kind of a related question, but you mentioned Skytorn earlier, which was another Metroidvania that you were working on. And when that game was cancelled, one of the reasons for its cancellation was that it never worked out what it wanted to be. And I was sitting here being like, Skytorn, Earthblade, it's like the same name, but opposite. And it's also Metroidvania, it's also made by you. Is Earthblade to some extent Skytorn finding itself, or is it completely different game?
No, I think definitely there is a lot of that. There's a lot of Skytorn spirit in Earthblade, definitely. The main issues with the Skytorn at the time was that I was trying to make a Metroidvania, but I was trying to make a procedurally generated one.
Right.
And I was trying to explore that space, and it just was kind of clashing because I had this kind of story I wanted to tell and this dynamic, and I couldn't get the procedural generation to work in a way that actually like made that more interesting. And I could have gone like way more into like push it way more in a Terraria kind of direction where it's just like more sandboxy, more actual procedural space, or I could go way more into more of a story-driven thing. And those two things were kind of fighting each other. I could never quite mesh them together. And it was kind of like, why am I making a procedural thing if I'm trying to, tell this story? At the time, I didn't want to just make a direct Metroidvania. So I was like, well, if I take out all the proceduralness stuff, it just kind of feels like a very standard Metroidvania. And I wasn't very, very excited by the idea at the time. So, and then with Celeste was kind of like in the middle of development. And I was kind of like, well, this seems like this project's has a lot more direction right now. So it made more sense at the time. But I'd say that, Earthblade definitely takes a lot of the spirit of Skytorn and what it was trying to be. But obviously Earthblade is not procedurally generated. It's just it's a designed world and a designed space. So
cool.
Yeah, nice. I don't know where to end that exactly.
I'm glad Skytorn lives on in some form. So as we get towards the end of the time, I guess kind of keeping on this theme of how you all work together, I said at the start, it's been a long time now on a lot of games, and it's more or less, as far as I can tell, a lot of the same team across that time. And you've been through, I know some of you were in Brazil, some of you were in Vancouver, you've worked through the pandemic and lockdowns. As what seems to be quite a long record for like a small indie team, do you have any tips for other aspiring indie developers or small teams that exist currently?
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to give kind of like big suggestions. I think a lot of time what works would not work for other people, or is often like a product of its time as well. A lot of the stuff, for our games and where I am is just like, right place, right time, right setting and all that stuff. But I think just finding projects you're excited about making and people you like working with is huge, which is obviously a given. But I think sometimes it can be easy to get kind of lost in like the technical stuff or trying to learn everything ahead of time or figure out exactly all the stuff you need to know. And sometimes it's better to kind of just like find people you like working with and just start making something and then worrying about the ramifications and all the little details later. Because as long as you can kind of like get started on something, that's the most important thing. Yeah.
Just make stuff with cool people is an enduring tip. And then I guess to another thing we spoke about quite a lot, which is you've made a lot of game frameworks, you've made a lot of tools, and I have noticed that does seem to be an addiction of game developers to make lots of tools along the way. What attracts you to making game frameworks? You mentioned Foster, we've spoken about Blah a little bit, and I imagine there's others elsewhere. Like, what keeps bringing you back to doing that?
I think it's mostly just I like learning the code stuff. I like learning about how systems work, and so I kind of like exploring that space a little bit. I love making games, and I like making that's definitely what I like most. But there's times when I kind of just like the systemsy, engine-y stuff of just like what is involved in making something that is much more just like a system. And I also, like I said earlier, kind of what the black box thing of like using something off the shelf versus using our own stuff. I like the learning process of using our own stuff and like seeing, hey, what does it actually take to just, do we have to use the gigantic engine, or can we, what is actually involved in like making our own thing? And a lot of the time it's not actually as much as I would expect to make this stuff. Like it's not a lot of code. It's definitely a learning process. I've been, learning how this stuff works over a long time, but oftentimes it ends up being easier than I thought it would be. And then it's fun. So yeah, I learn a lot and it's fun.
That's awesome. So I guess kind of an extension topic. If someone hasn't implemented the systems themselves and is thinking like, oh, I'd be really interested in writing my own physics engine or my own lighting system or my own shader, whatever is there like a project from that world you would recommend that people start in?
I guess it depends on what specific, like for physics engine stuff, there's like more advanced proper physics engines like Box2D, which is open source. So you can start, digging through it, but you probably need actual books on how that stuff works as well, which I unfortunately don't have recommendations for. But for simple like AABB physics stuff, honestly, like even the Pico 8 version of Celeste you can look at, because that is just that's very similar to the actual code in normal Celeste in terms of how the physics work. I'm trying to think of like other open source projects. If you're more interested in like how like frameworks work and how like game engines work, I think just looking at the source code for like FNA, which is a port of XNA, where you can kind of see like this is a C# thing that's running on top of SDL2, which a lot of stuff uses, which is really cool. Or you can even just look at SDL2 itself and just like the inner workings of SDL can be kind of complicated. But if you just want to try making something on top of it, it's quite friendly, honestly. So you can just open a window and start doing stuff with it. And it's not too bad. I don't think other projects that are really cool. Raylib is a really cool one, which is like like a C game framework, or any kind of framework, but like a game targeted framework. And it's just like C, like a little C API that just has like a bunch of calls for like, oh, you want to create a window and then create a texture and draw this texture in this place. Like it has all that stuff just kind of ready to go, which is great if you're just like wanting to write your own thing on top of it.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great recommendations. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I guess that kind of brings us to the end of the time. Noel, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is super fun.